Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you didn't see the knife until it was already in your heart? Hi, family. Kindly help subscribe to my YouTube channel to help us grow and to enjoy more beautiful stories. Naomi Wills believed Sean Hopes was the one thing in her life that finally made sense. She just didn't know. She was only a part of his plan. The morning Naomi met Sean, she was late for work for the first time since she joined Davin & Co., a mid-sized marketing firm in the heart of Seattle. Rain had soaked her hair and stained her white shirt, and as she stood by the elevator, trying to dry herself with tissues, a deep voice behind her said, "Rough morning." She turned to see a man holding two coffees, tall, calm, and strangely put together despite the storm outside. His smile was disarming, the kind that made you forget what you were worried about a second ago. "You could say that," Naomi replied, forcing a smile, unaware that this single conversation would rewrite her life in the worst way possible. Sean offered her one of the coffees without asking her preference, as if he already knew she needed it. She took it a little awkward, but grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm Sean Hopes, by the way, the new business consultant." She nodded. "Naomi Wills, marketing associate." The elevator doors opened, and as they stepped in, Naomi's reflection caught her attention in the metallic door. Her hair messy, eyeliner smudged. She thought she looked ridiculous next to him, but Sean's attention was focused entirely on her, almost too attentively. He asked about her work, her role, and even complimented her ideas after seeing her name on a project board that morning. Naomi didn't know that he'd already read every file about her. He'd spent the night before studying the company's hierarchy, noting which employee could get him close to the biggest client, Mr. Warren, a man whose trust was worth millions. And Naomi Wills, a rising strategist who had impressed Warren with a bold campaign pitch weeks ago, was the easiest bridge. By noon that day, Sean had already positioned himself near her workspace, asking innocent questions about client behavior and internal systems, making her feel seen, valued. She had no idea he was collecting information piece by piece like a hunter arranging traps. But what made Sean's plan dangerous wasn't just his intelligence. It was how easily he could mimic sincerity. He listened like he cared, smiled like he meant it, and said Naomi's name as though it was something precious. Days turned into weeks, and Naomi began looking forward to seeing him. Sean had a way of showing up at the right moment. When she was stressed, when she felt unnoticed, when she doubted herself. He'd appear with small gestures, a coffee, a joke, or simply a silent presence beside her desk. Naomi hadn't realized how lonely she'd become since her last breakup with Liam's friend, who left her for a promotion overseas. Sean's attention filled that quiet space in her life. She told Susan, her closest friend at work, that maybe it was fate. "He's probably the best thing that's happened since I joined here." Naomi laughed one evening as they packed up. "He listens, Sue. Really listens." Susan, always cautious, raised an eyebrow. "You sure he's not just good at pretending?" Naomi frowned. Why would he? But that question would haunt her months later. Meanwhile, Sean was deepening his approach. Every story he told Naomi was calculated, a sprinkle of truth coated with enough vulnerability to make her trust him. He spoke about losing opportunities, about people using him, about wanting to build something real. Naomi, who had always valued honesty, saw herself in those confessions. Her walls fell. The following month, the firm faced a tight deadline for a major pitch. Naomi stayed back late every night, and Sean began staying too, to help. Their collaboration turned into companionship, laughs over instant noodles, deep talks over shared playlists, tired glances that turned into soft smiles. One Friday night, after they submitted their final proposal, Naomi thanked him. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. Sean looked at her for a long time before replying, "I wanted to." And he meant it. At least part of him did. He hadn't expected Naomi to be kind, or humble, or so unaware of her own warmth. But his plan was already in motion. His small startup, Hope Strategies, was on the verge of a deal that could take down Davin & Co.'s dominance. The only missing piece was Naomi's client list, specifically Mr. Warren's current campaign strategy. All he needed was access. Naomi trusted Sean enough by then to share files casually, thinking he just wanted to understand the process. She didn't see the quiet excitement behind his calm expression when she forwarded those documents to his personal email for convenience. But one night, when Naomi walked back into the office to retrieve her forgotten phone, she found Sean in the conference room, alone, typing quickly on his laptop with her files open. "Sean," she called softly. He startled too quickly. "Naomi, I was just checking something from earlier." He minimized the screen, but not before she caught her own name in an email subject line. "What's that?" she asked, stepping closer. "Nothing important," he said smoothly, but his voice wavered for the first time. Naomi hesitated, confusion swirling in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but her instincts whispered something wasn't right. Still, she let it go. She didn't want to be that insecure woman who ruined something good because of paranoia. Sean noticed that hesitation and exhaled in relief. The plan was still safe for now, but something shifted in him after that night. Naomi's trust, her softness, her belief in him. It all started to feel heavier than he'd expected. He caught himself watching her laugh at her desk, tucking her hair behind her ear, and wondered when she'd stopped being a target and started becoming someone he didn't want to hurt. He ignored it. He had come too far to stop now. A week later, the deal he'd been chasing finally came through. Hope Strategies signed a partnership with one of Davin & Co.'s biggest competitors, thanks to the insights Sean had gathered. The very next morning, Naomi walked into the office to an atmosphere of tension, clients calling, confusion spreading. She didn't know yet, but her firm was about to lose its largest contract. Sean smiled from across the room, guilt tightening his chest as he watched her try to calm everyone down. That was when Susan whispered to her, "Naomi, do you know your boyfriend's company just announced a deal with our rival?" Naomi froze. Boyfriend, rival. The words crashed together like thunder. She turned toward Sean, who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. And in that instant, she knew. Something inside her went cold. She walked straight to his desk, ignoring the murmurs, and said, "Tell me it's not true." Sean opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The office was silent. For the first time, Naomi saw him for what he was. Not her partner, not her friend, but a stranger who had walked into her life with a purpose that had nothing to do with love. And though he wanted to explain, he couldn't. He just sat there, still, watching the woman he had used finally understand that every smile, every coffee, every late night, it was all part of the game. Sean didn't show up at work the next day, and the office buzzed with quiet speculation. Naomi tried to stay composed, replying to messages, sending updates, but her chest felt like someone had pressed a heavy hand over it. She told herself maybe it was all a misunderstanding, maybe he'd explain, but the silence from him was louder than any excuse. Late that evening, her phone finally rang. "Can we talk?" Sean's voice was calm, almost pleading. Naomi's heart raced as she agreed to meet him outside a coffee shop near the pier. The night air was cool, the sky gray with mist, and Sean looked different, less confident, more human. "Naomi," he began, "I know what you heard today. It's not what you think." She crossed her arms. "You're working with our competitor, Sean. What exactly am I supposed to think?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yes, my company partner with them, but it's a temporary consulting deal. I didn't steal anything from Davin & Company. I'm just trying to keep my business alive." His eyes looked honest, tired, even desperate. Naomi wanted to believe him so badly that the doubt in her heart started to weaken. "You could have told me," she said softly. "You didn't have to hide it." "I didn't want to lose you," he replied. That sentence disarmed her completely. The man who could have been her enemy suddenly sounded like someone who needed saving. Sean reached for her hand and added, "I care about you, Naomi. I just need you to trust me." The weeks that followed blurred into something gentle and strangely fragile. Sean became more attentive, almost protective, texting to ask if she'd eaten, showing up with her favorite snacks, listening when she talked about her projects. The uneasiness between them faded bit by bit, and Naomi convinced herself that maybe love really was about forgiving and trying again. Yet beneath every smile, every reassurance, Sean's mind was still divided. He had patched things up with her not because the guilt had vanished, but because he needed time. His deal with the rival company had gone through, but the board wanted more insight into Davin and Co.'s upcoming pitch strategy. And the only person who had access to the draft proposal was Naomi. One night, Naomi invited him over for dinner. It wasn't anything fancy. Pasta, wine, and quiet music humming from her small speaker. Sean watched her move around the kitchen in her faded sweatshirt, humming under her breath, and for a moment, the plan slipped from his mind completely. He saw a woman who deserved honesty, who trusted him without conditions. When she caught him staring, she smiled shyly. "What?" "Nothing," he said, smiling back. "You just make this feel like home." The sentence wasn't rehearsed, and that scared him. He was crossing the line again, blurring business with emotion. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch, Naomi showed him her presentation slides for an upcoming client review. "Don't show anyone yet," she warned. "It's not finalized." "Of course," Sean said, though his mind had already started calculating. He could see notes, color codes, and project schedules that his partner company would kill to access. But as Naomi leaned against his shoulder, he hesitated. Every bit of information he took from her now would be an act of betrayal she could never forgive. Still, the next morning, his partner, Smith, sent him a message. "We need the data by next week or the deal is off." Sean closed his eyes, the text burning on his screen. He was trapped between two worlds, the one that promised success and the one that had started to feel like peace. Over the following days, he convinced himself it was just business, that Naomi would be fine. He began to ask subtle questions again. What did Mr. Warren think about the new strategy? Or, are they changing the ad budget this quarter? Naomi, believing he was just curious about her work, answered freely. Each piece of information built his company's advantage, but every conversation also deepened the ache in his chest. He started to notice the small things she did for him. How she left sticky notes with encouraging words on his desk, how she always saved him a seat during meetings, how her laughter softened the room. She trusted him without hesitation, and that trust became the quiet punishment he lived with every day. One evening, Susan dropped by Naomi's apartment and found Sean there, helping her assemble furniture. Susan's smile was polite, but her eyes sharp. "You two look cozy," she said, half teasing. "Just helping out," Sean replied easily. When Susan went to the kitchen with Naomi, she whispered, "Naomi, are you sure about him? Something about that guy feels strategic." Naomi frowned. "Susan, not you too. He's trying. Can we please give him a chance?" Susan sighed, not wanting to argue. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Meanwhile, Sean's internal war reached its peak. Smith kept pushing, sending spreadsheets and deadlines. And every time Sean delayed, his reputation slipped further. Finally, the pressure became unbearable. One night, while Naomi slept beside him on the couch after a movie, he quietly reached for her laptop. He told himself it was just one file, just one confirmation he needed to protect his deal. But as the screen glowed in the dim light, he hesitated again, staring at her peaceful face. For a long moment, he thought of shutting it down. Then his phone buzzed. Smith again. Now or never. Sean copied the draft proposal and sent it. The email whooshed out, sealing Naomi's fate and his own guilt in one motion. He shut the laptop and leaned back, exhaling shakily. Beside him, Naomi stirred, murmuring his name in her sleep. The sound nearly broke him. The next day, she noticed him distant. "You're quiet today," she said. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," he lied. "Work stuff." Naomi smiled sympathetically and squeezed his hand. "Don't overwork yourself. You already do too much." Her kindness burned more than her suspicion ever could. A week later, Naomi's firm presented their proposal, only to find a competitor had pitched the same idea 2 days earlier, down to the smallest details. Chaos followed. Executives yelled, accusations flew, and Naomi's name came up as the one with access to the draft. Her heart pounded when her supervisor asked, "Naomi, did you share this with anyone outside the company?" She froze. Only Sean had seen it. The realization hit like ice water. That evening, she called him, voice trembling. "Sean, did you show my slides to anyone?" There was a pause. "No," he said too quickly. "Why would I?" "Because everything Everything we worked on was presented by another firm. Yours. Silence filled the line. Naomi waited, breath unsteady, and then she whispered, "Please tell me it's not true." Sean closed his eyes. He wanted to confess, to explain, but cowardice held his tongue. "It's not true," he said. "You have to believe me." "I do," she replied faintly, but her tone lacked conviction. After she hung up, Sean sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The manipulation was complete, but it didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like rot spreading quietly through his chest. He had everything he wanted, and yet somehow, it already felt like loss. Days turned into weeks, and Naomi's workplace still hadn't recovered from the chaos. Meetings turned tense, emails carried undertones of suspicion, and whispers followed her whenever she walked by. The trust she had built over the years began to crumble. Despite everything, she didn't confront Sean again. She wanted to believe he was innocent, that maybe it was all coincidence. But late at night, when she lay awake replaying every conversation, every detail, doubt crept in like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Sean, on the other hand, was falling apart quietly. The deal he'd secured with the rival firm went through, and his company's profit margin rose overnight. On paper, he had won, but reality felt empty. Naomi's laughter didn't come as often. Her eyes no longer held the same light when she looked at him, and the distance between them grew even when they sat side by side. One evening, while she stirred a pot of soup in silence, he asked gently, "You've been quiet lately. Are you okay?" She nodded without turning. "Just tired." He wanted to confess everything right there, to tell her he'd made a mistake, that he didn't mean to hurt her, but when she finally looked up, her eyes looked too fragile to break. So he stayed quiet, carrying the guilt like an invisible weight. Susan's suspicions hadn't faded either. One afternoon, she showed up at Sean's office under the guise of delivering a file. While waiting at reception, she overheard two junior staff laughing about how Sean's inside connection had helped them land the Davin & Co. account. Her stomach sank. When she got home that evening, she went straight to Naomi's apartment. Naomi opened the door, looking exhausted, her hair tied in a loose bun. "What is it, Susan? You look like you've seen a ghost." Susan exhaled sharply. "I went to Sean's office today, and I heard something." "Naomi, something you need to know." Naomi frowned, setting her cup of tea down. "What did you hear?" "That he's been working with the same people who pitched your company's proposal. They said he had inside help." Naomi froze. "That doesn't prove anything." "Naomi, please don't defend him again," Susan said, voice softening. "I'm telling you this because you're my friend. You've trusted the wrong man before, and I don't want you to lose yourself again." That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. Her chest ached from the storm of emotions fighting within her. Love, disbelief, humiliation, fear. She opened her messages with Sean, scrolling through their chats. "Good morning, sunshine, proud of you always, don't stress too much today." Each message felt like a lie now. She typed and erased a dozen replies before finally sending. "Sean, can we meet tomorrow?" They met at the same pier where they had once reconciled. This time, Naomi didn't smile. The waves crashed gently against the wood, the wind cold against her face. "I just need to ask once more," she said quietly. "Did you betray me?" Sean's eyes darted away. "Naomi, please," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Don't lie. I already know." He swallowed hard. There was no point pretending anymore. "Yes," he whispered. "I did." The words shattered her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Was I just a project to you?" Sean shook his head desperately. "No, Naomi. You were never that. I didn't plan to hurt you. I was just desperate to save my company. It was supposed to be temporary, just numbers, reports, nothing personal." She laughed bitterly, tears burning her eyes. "Nothing personal? You stole my trust, Sean. You let me believe we were building something real while you were tearing down everything I had worked for." He reached out to touch her, but she stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. "You don't get to fix this with words." He wanted to explain, to promise change, but she turned and walked away before he could say another word. The echo of her footsteps faded, leaving only the wind and the guilt gnawing at his chest. For days after that, Sean tried to call, to text, to show up, but Naomi blocked him everywhere. He sent her long messages that went unread, emails that returned undelivered. He even left flowers by her apartment door once, but Susan threw them away before Naomi saw them. At work, Naomi's reputation slowly began to recover after an internal audit cleared her of suspicion, but the damage to her spirit lingered. She became quieter, more guarded. The woman who once believed in second chances now built walls even her closest friends couldn't climb. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed again, Sean's number, but under a different contact name. Against her better judgment, she answered. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," Sean began softly, "but I needed to say this properly. I didn't just lose your trust, Naomi. I lost myself in all of it. I thought winning meant getting ahead, but now I see it meant losing you." Naomi's voice was calm, but cold. "You don't get to say that now. You can't ruin someone's life and then talk about love." He swallowed hard. "You're right, but I'm sorry. For real this time." She hesitated, her anger wavering for a moment, but then she exhaled. "Sean, you didn't just use me for information. You used my heart. I can forgive you someday, maybe, but I'll never be yours again." He didn't argue. He just whispered, "I understand," before the line went dead. Sean sat there, staring at the quiet screen, realizing that sometimes the cost of ambition isn't money, it's peace. Naomi spent the next few weeks rebuilding. She started a new project, traveled for a short conference, and began reconnecting with old friends she'd neglected. Every now and then, she'd think of Sean, not with hatred, but with that hollow ache people feel when something beautiful ends the wrong way. One rainy evening, while watching the city lights from her balcony, she finally said it out loud. To herself, to the silence, maybe to him, wherever he was, "I used you because I loved the version of me I thought you saw. But you used me because you love what I could give. Now, I'm done being useful." And for the first time in a long while, she smiled. Not because she was over it, but because she was finally free. The months that followed carried the silence of things left unsaid. Naomi no longer jumped at the sound of her phone. Her heart no longer tightened when she passed places they used to visit together. Life had slowly returned to her, a quieter, lonelier version, but hers nonetheless. She poured herself into her work, building new partnerships, regaining trust, and making sure her name stood firm where others had tried to tear it down. Still, in the deepest parts of her, the wound Sean left throbbed like a memory that refused to fade. One evening, while reviewing a proposal for a new client, her company's director called her into the boardroom. "Naomi," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "we've just received a joint project proposal from another firm, Hope's Consultancy. They requested that you oversee the collaboration personally." Her hand froze midair. She hadn't heard that name in months, but the sound of it sent a chill down her spine. "You can decline if you want," the director continued, sensing her discomfort. "But it's a big deal, and I think you'd handle it professionally." Naomi forced a smile. "Of course, I'll handle it." Inside, she wasn't sure if she was ready, but she wasn't going to let him see weakness again. 2 days later, they met in the conference room. Sean walked in looking like a shadow of the man she once knew. His hair slightly unkempt, his eyes tired, his voice softer. For a second, the air felt heavy between them, the kind of silence that carries too many memories. "Naomi," he greeted. "It's been a while." She nodded, cold and composed. "Let's keep this professional." Throughout the meeting, she avoided his gaze, speaking only when necessary. But he kept glancing at her, every now and then, with the quiet remorse of a man haunted by what he destroyed. When the meeting ended, and the others left the room, Sean lingered. "Can we talk?" he asked. Naomi hesitated. "About what?" "About us," he said simply. She shook her head. "There is no us, Sean. There hasn't been for a long time." He moved closer, but not too close. "Naomi, I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came because I couldn't stand pretending anymore. I still think about you every day." She laughed, but came out dry. "You should have thought about that before you used me." He flinched, her words cutting through whatever fragments of pride he had left. "I know," he said quietly. "I live with that every day. Naomi gathered her files and walked toward the door, but before leaving, she paused. Sean, you'll never understand what you took from me. It wasn't just love or trust. It was the part of me that believed people could be different. Then she walked out, leaving him standing there with nothing but his regret. That night, he went home and sat in his car for hours, replaying every mistake. He had thought success would fill the emptiness, but his office walls felt like a cage now, his victories meaningless. For the first time, he realized the full cost of his choices. He didn't just lose Naomi, he lost himself somewhere between ambition and guilt. Days later, Naomi was invited to speak at a women's leadership event. Standing before the audience, she talked about resilience, betrayal, and the strength it takes to rebuild from brokenness. Sometimes, she said, her voice steady, we mistake manipulation for love because we crave to be needed. But true strength begins when you stop begging to be understood by someone who benefits from your confusion. The room erupted in applause, but behind the applause her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the calm of acceptance. Meanwhile, Sean watched the live stream from his office. We heard her say those words. He knew there was no going back. He couldn't fix it, couldn't rewrite it. Naomi had found herself again, and in doing so, she erased the version of him that once mattered. Weeks later, by some twist of fate, they crossed paths again at a quiet cafe. Naomi was meeting a client. Sean was there for coffee. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, time froze. He smiled faintly, as though asking for a silent chance, but she only nodded politely before turning back to her laptop. That nod was her goodbye, a quiet one but final. He watched her leave, realizing that she didn't hate him anymore. And that was worse, because hate meant she still felt something. But now she felt nothing. Sean stayed in that cafe long after she was gone, stirring his cold coffee and staring at the door she walked through. He whispered to himself, I used you. I will never marry you, because I was too blind to see you were the only thing real in my life. The words hung in the air, heavy, meaningless, and too late. Naomi, on the other hand, never looked back. She went on with her life, stronger, colder, wiser. Love, she decided, was not something she was searching for anymore. Some wounds didn't heal with time, they just stopped bleeding. But the scars, they stayed, reminding her of the lesson that almost broke her. And so, the story of Naomi Wills and Sean Hopes ended not with fireworks or forgiveness, but with silence, the kind that follows when love burns itself out, leaving behind only ashes and the faint memory of what could have been. Weeks melted into months, and the world kept turning as if nothing had happened. The noise of life slowly buried what once felt like the loudest heartbreak in Naomi Wills's chest. She had learned to move through her days with grace again, showing up, delivering results, laughing at small jokes in meetings. But every laughter carried a certain restraint, as though her heart remembered to stay guarded. The city no longer reminded her of Sean Hopes, yet sometimes she caught fragments of him in the smallest things. The smell of roasted coffee from the cafe where they talked for hours, the sight of a gray coat like his passing by on the street, or the echo of a song he once hummed absent-mindedly while driving. But even those memories had begun to lose color. They faded the way old photographs do, still there, but detached, powerless. Her friends noticed the change. Susan would occasionally tease her about being too focused on work, but Naomi only smiled and said, peace is addictive. And it was true. Peace, not joy, had become her prize. She no longer needed love to validate her. She only needed the quiet assurance that she would never again become someone's stepping stone. Sean, meanwhile, drifted through his own kind of silence. The company that had once been his pride was thriving on paper, but he had stopped celebrating the wins. Success felt hollow now, like clapping alone in an empty theater. The faces that surrounded him were all transactional, clients, investors, colleagues, but none of them looked at him the way Naomi used to, like he mattered beyond numbers and strategy. He went through therapy for a while, hoping to understand why he had destroyed something pure for something temporary. But understanding didn't bring forgiveness. Some nights he would scroll through her old photos, the one still left online, and stare at the way she used to smile. Freely, unguarded, almost foolishly in love. It reminded him that the version of himself she once loved no longer existed. One cold Friday evening, Naomi attended a networking dinner arranged by her company. It was nothing grand, just professionals sharing ideas, soft music in the background, and glasses clinking. A man named Liam Wealth, a quiet, thoughtful consultant, struck up a conversation with her about resilience in corporate spaces. He had kind eyes and didn't force laughter. He listened. For a moment, Naomi caught herself thinking, maybe this is what peace looks like in human form. They talked for hours, exchanged cards, and that was all. No spark, no promises, just a mutual understanding between two people who respected silence more than small talk. When she got home that night, she didn't think about Sean, and that was how she knew she was healing. Still, life had a way of throwing reminders when least expected. Months later, during a leadership summit, Sean took the stage as one of the speakers. Naomi hadn't known he'd be there until she saw his name on the program, and her pulse quickened, not from longing but from the strange calm of closure. He spoke about ethics, irony dripping through every word, and somewhere in his speech he paused, looking out at the crowd before saying, "Success means nothing if you lose the person who made you human." His eyes flicked briefly toward her. Naomi didn't flinch. When he finished, the audience applauded. She did too, but only politely, the way one applauds a stranger's performance. Afterward, he approached her quietly in the lobby. "Naomi," he said, almost a whisper, "you look good." She nodded. "So do you." There was a pause thick with memories neither wanted to unpack. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though they both knew he'd said it before. She smiled faintly. "I know." And with that, she extended her hand, shook his once, and walked away. No tears, no lingering look, just finality. That was the real ending. The kind where no music plays, no hearts reconcile, just two people finally standing in the ruins of what they built and realizing that nothing could grow there again. Naomi went home that night, kicked off her heels, and stood by the window watching the city lights flicker like broken stars. She poured herself a glass of wine, took a slow sip, and whispered to the empty room, "I used you, and I let myself be used, but I will never let that version of me exist again." The air felt lighter, as though the words themselves had set her free. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, washing the streets clean. Inside, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who finally understood that endings don't always need closure. They just need peace. And so, in a world that kept spinning without apology, Naomi learned the hardest truth of all. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with freedom. Sean would go on to chase success, forever haunted by what he lost. Naomi would go on to build something stronger from what she learned. And love would return one day, perhaps in another form, softer, quieter, more honest. But for now, there was only silence. The kind that doesn't ache anymore. The kind that means it's over. Time has a cruel way of softening what once burned like fire. Months slipped into a year, and though the world forgot, Sean Hopes never did. His life was still polished from the outside. The tailored suits, the sleek car, the deals that kept his company alive. But inside, everything rang hollow. Every success reminded him of the one thing he couldn't buy back. Sometimes he'd see a woman with Naomi's hair walking ahead of him, and, for a fleeting second, hope it was her, only to feel that familiar ache when it wasn't. Regret became his morning companion and his nightly ghost. He started skipping events, stopped answering calls, even missed a few key meetings. His board whispered about burnout, but Sean knew it was something else entirely. It was the weight of consequence, the kind that doesn't scream but lingers like dust on everything you touch. Naomi, on the other hand, had learned to live softly again. Her career flourished. Her face began to appear in magazines, highlighting women leaders, transforming corporate ethics. She wasn't chasing recognition anymore. It simply found her. The woman who once second-guessed her worth now stood firmly in it. She bought a small apartment overlooking the river, started painting on weekends, and filled her space with books and quiet music. People sometimes asked if she was seeing anyone, and she'd just smile and say, "I'm seeing peace." But there were nights, quiet ones, when she'd look at her reflection and whisper, "You made it through." Not proudly, just truthfully. One evening, while attending a business seminar in another city, she ran into Nancy Wealth, an old friend from college who now worked for a major PR firm. They talked for hours over dinner, laughing about the past, and Nancy eventually said, I once met that guy, Sean. He came to pitch a partnership months ago. He looked lost." Naomi paused, her fork midair. "Lost?" "Yeah," Nancy said. "Not like he was struggling financially. Just empty. He talked about ethics and change, but it sounded like a man trying to convince himself." Naomi didn't respond. She just nodded, quietly processing the irony. That night, back in her hotel room, she stood by the window again. Different city, same stillness. She thought about Sean for the first time in months, not with anger or longing, but with a strange compassion, not for the man he was, but for the man who never learned. Some people destroy good things because they don't believe they deserve them, she realized. And maybe that was his curse, to always chase something he could never keep. Meanwhile, Sean tried to make amends in subtle ways. He donated to women's empowerment programs, mentored young professionals, and tried to speak honestly in interviews about integrity and emotional awareness. But no amount of good deeds could rewrite the chapter he'd burned. The public saw redemption. He saw penance. In his quiet moments, he'd draft unsent letters to Naomi, not to win her back, but to unburden his guilt. "You taught me that love is not a strategy," one letter read, "and I wish I had learned it sooner." He never mailed any of them. One afternoon, while walking near the river where they once met, he spotted her from a distance, hair tied loosely, wearing a beige coat, talking to someone on the phone, laughing softly. He froze. The world blurred around him as he watched her cross the street, radiant in a way he'd never seen before, lighter, unburdened. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to call out her name. He just smiled, faintly, painfully, realizing she had finally reached the peace he never would. Naomi, unaware of his presence, continued walking. The wind brushed against her face, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Somewhere deep inside, she felt something shift. Not sadness, not nostalgia, just acceptance. Whatever had tied them once had dissolved completely. She had learned that closure doesn't always come from words or apologies. Sometimes it comes from silence and distance doing their quiet work. That night, Sean went home and finally opened the drawer where he'd kept her last message. That simple text from long ago, "Sean, can we meet tomorrow?" He read it once, then tore into pieces. It wasn't bitterness, it was release. For the first time, he allowed himself to let her go. And somewhere across the city, Naomi painted until dawn. The canvas showed a river under a stormy sky, half dark, half light, just like the parts of her story she'd learned to live with. She signed her name at the bottom, set the brush down, and whispered to herself, "Some love stories aren't meant to last. They're meant to teach." Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent to their parallel worlds. Sean went to bed with the echo of what he'd lost. Naomi slept peacefully with the strength of what she'd become. And that was how their story remained. Not with reunion or revenge, but with distance that spoke louder than words, and the quiet truth that not every love deserves a second chance. Years passed quietly, the kind of years that don't rush but gently fold into each other. The memory of Sean Hopes became something Naomi Wills carried not as pain, but as a soft scar beneath her calm exterior. Time had stretched the distance between who she was and who she became. Her career continued to thrive. She was now head of strategy at one of the country's most respected consulting firms, leading young minds with the same integrity she once fought to preserve. Her name commanded respect in boardrooms, not because of her ambition alone, but because of the quiet strength behind it. She had learned that survival wasn't loud. Sometimes it was simply about staying kind in a world that hadn't been kind to you. Her apartment had changed too. The once empty corners were now filled with warmth. Indoor plants, paintings she'd done over the years, and photographs of moments she chose to remember. There were no pictures of Sean, not a trace of that chapter anywhere. But if anyone had asked, She wouldn't have denied that he existed. She would simply say, he was part of the story that shaped me. Because he was. He had been both the fire and the lesson. Sean's life had taken a different route. He had stepped down from the helm of his company after a quiet scandal involving an ethical breach that wasn't entirely his fault but reminded everyone of his past. He relocated to another city, started consulting privately, and kept to himself. The once charismatic man now moved through life with deliberate humility, speaking only when necessary, teaching young entrepreneurs about mistakes to avoid, not just in business, but in humanity. His words carried the weight of someone who had lived them. Success means nothing if you lose yourself in the process, he often said, a truth he'd learned too late. Every year, on the anniversary of the deal that ruined Naomi's career, he would find himself by the same river where they'd last spoken. He never brought flowers, never tried to contact her again. He just sat there, watching the water move. There was peace in the routine, a silent acknowledgement that some debts are paid through remembrance, not redemption. Naomi's peace, however, was different. She had learned to let go without bitterness. Sometimes she would pass by that same river, now cleaner, brighter, busier. She'd stop for a few minutes, not to remember him, but to remember herself. The version of her that had once loved recklessly, trusted blindly, and survived completely. There was something sacred in surviving what once tried to break you. One Saturday afternoon, she ran into Susan at a bookstore. They hugged like sisters who hadn't seen each other in years. Susan had 2 kids now, glowing with the warmth of family life. "You look happy," Naomi said, smiling. "And you look free," Susan replied. They laughed, caught up on old memories, and talked about life's small surprises. At one point, Susan said quietly, "I saw him once. Sean. He looked tired." Naomi nodded, her voice calm. "He's living his consequences, Susan, and I'm living my peace." That evening, Naomi went home, lit a candle, and sat on her balcony watching the sunset. She didn't need anyone to fill her silence anymore. There was no ache, no haunting memory, just gratitude for what life had taught her through its chaos. She picked up her journal and wrote, "Maybe love isn't about forever. Maybe it's about who you become when it ends." Then she closed it, set it aside, and smiled faintly. Across another city, Sean stood before a small group of interns, lecturing about emotional intelligence in business. When one of them asked, "Sir, have you ever regretted a decision that changed your life?" He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, but regret teaches discipline, and sometimes that's the only way you learn who you really are." He ended the session early and walked outside. The evening light fell softly on his face, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered where Naomi was. Not out of longing, just curiosity about how peace might look on her. He hoped it looked beautiful. Back in her apartment, Naomi painted another river scene. This one calmer, golden, infinite. She signed her name quietly, turned off the light, and whispered to the darkness, "I used you. I will never marry you, but I thank you. Because through you, I found me." And just like that, her story closed not with tears, not with hatred, but with something deeper, understanding. Life after heartbreak wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently. Sean carried his silence like a shadow. Naomi carried hers like light. And somewhere between those 2 silences, their story ended, not tragically, but truthfully. Years have a way of carrying consequences farther than we imagine. What Sean and Naomi once shared had ended years ago, yet its echoes stretched beyond the 2 of them, into people who had only brushed against their story, into spaces where their choices had unknowingly left marks. Susan often thought about it. She had watched the rise and fall of both, had seen what love, pride, and silence could do to even the strongest hearts. She had been there when Naomi cried quietly in her office bathroom, wiping tears with tissue before a meeting. She had also seen Sean in his glory days, standing at the center of a crowd, all charm and power. And she had seen both versions fade, him into guilt, her into grace. Sometimes, when she told her younger colleagues stories about a woman I once knew, they would listen in awe, never realizing it was Naomi she was talking about. One of those colleagues, a young analyst named Emma, was new to the firm Naomi now led. She admired Naomi from afar, seeing her as everything she wanted to become: strong, composed, brilliant. But one afternoon, Emma walked into Naomi's office to deliver a report and saw something that startled her. Naomi sitting quietly, staring out the window, lost in thought. There was no sadness in her face, only a stillness so deep it felt sacred. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Emma asked softly. Naomi smiled. "Perfectly fine. Just remembering a version of myself that used to chase validation." Emma didn't understand then, but years later, when she faced her own heartbreak, she would. The ripple had reached her too, the wisdom of someone else's scars becoming her own quiet strength. Meanwhile, Sean's lessons were doing the same. One of his interns, a boy named Luke, once stayed behind after class to ask, "Sir, do you think people change?" Sean looked up from his notes and replied, "Yes, but not because they want to. They change because they have to." Luke didn't know the story behind that answer, but it would shape him. Years later, when he built his own company, he'd choose integrity over profit, remembering Sean's weary voice. And though Sean never knew it, that choice saved Luke's business from ruin. The ripple continued. But life wasn't all wisdom and redemption. There were still people caught in the leftover storms. Smith, Sean's old business partner, never forgave him for the scandal that forced them apart. His bitterness turned into obsession, and in trying to destroy Sean's name further, he ended up destroying his own. He leaked documents that backfired, revealing his own corrupt dealings. The irony was cruel but fitting. Another ripple, another consequence of a choice made years ago when loyalty was traded for ego. Naomi's ripple reached her family in quieter ways. Her younger cousin, Nancy, had once been engaged to a man who treated her with casual disrespect. Naomi had seen the signs and told her plainly, "Don't mistake persistence for love." Those words hit Nancy harder than any advice could. She called off the engagement a month later, saving herself from a life of quiet misery. She would later tell people, "My cousin taught me that peace is better than proving a point." Naomi never took credit. She didn't have to. Her story had already done the teaching. Still, some nights, Naomi would wake up from dreams where she was back in that old life, standing at Sean's office window, watching him make promises she knew he'd break. The dreams didn't hurt anymore, but they reminded her that every decision leaves a mark. She often said to herself, "We think love ends when people walk away, but it doesn't. It ends when the lesson finally sinks in." And hers had, completely. Sean, on his end, lived simply. No luxuries, no entourage. Just a small apartment, morning jogs, and the quiet hum of city life. One day, a former employee visited him, asking for advice on a merger. They talked for hours, and before leaving, the man said, "You've changed, Sean. You used to care about winning. Now you care about meaning." Sean smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you lose the wrong person," he said quietly, almost to himself. That night, he poured himself a glass of water, sat by the window, and thought of Naomi, not with longing, but with an ache that had learned to behave. He whispered, "You taught me everything I refused to learn when it mattered." He didn't expect her to hear it, but in some way, the universe did. Across town, Naomi was giving a lecture to a group of MBA students about resilience in leadership. She said something that made them pause. "Sometimes, the people who hurt you aren't villains. They're just mirrors showing you what parts of yourself you still need to heal." The class was silent, and in that silence, the ripple completed itself. The pain that once began as betrayal now existed as wisdom passed down to others. The ripple effect of love gone wrong had become something strange and beautiful. Sean's regret had shaped honesty in others. Naomi's healing had given courage to those around her. The chaos that once burned them had quietly become light for someone else's path. Neither of them knew it, but through the quiet aftermath of "I used you, I will never marry you," they had both left behind something worth remembering. Not love, not forgiveness, but impact. And maybe, in a world as unpredictable as theirs, that was enough. It had been nearly a decade since Naomi last saw Sean. Life had folded and refolded itself so many times that his face had blurred into memory, not pain. She had stopped expecting closure long ago, accepting that some doors remain closed because peace prefers it that way. But the past has a strange way of finding its moment, always when the heart feels safest. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that carried no warning. Naomi was on her way to a leadership conference at a downtown hotel when she saw a familiar name on the event program. Keynote speaker, Sean Hopes, founder, Hopes Consulting. For a few seconds, she froze. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and curiosity. She hadn't heard that name in years, hadn't allowed herself to imagine what he'd become. Her first instinct was to leave, to call in sick, to avoid the possibility of reopening wounds she'd already turned into lessons. But something stronger, perhaps the kind of quiet courage that only healing gives, made her stay. Inside the hall, everything was pristine. White lights, murmurs of ambition, the faint clinking of coffee cups. Naomi sat near the back, her pen in hand, but her heart oddly still. Then he walked in. Older, leaner, with streaks of gray in his hair, but unmistakably him. He looked like a man who had lived through the storms of his own making and learned humility the hard way. When he spoke, his voice carried no arrogance, just a weary grace that seemed to hush the room. I once thought leadership was about power, he began. But power without integrity is an expensive illusion. I learned that too late. Naomi's chest tightened slightly. Every word was a mirror held to the man she had known. The one who had once used her ambition as a stepping stone, who had chosen ego over love, deceit over truth. Yet now, as he spoke, she felt no anger, only recognition. People can change, but sometimes they do so only after they've lost the one who mattered most. When his talk ended, the crowd rose in applause. Sean's gaze scanned the room, and then stopped. On her. For the briefest second, their eyes met. He hesitated, visibly shaken, but then offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't return it. She simply gathered her notes and walked out quietly before the crowd dispersed. Hours later, as Naomi stepped out of the building, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Naomi. She turned. Sean stood a few feet away, holding his coat, looking uncertain, as though afraid to exist in the same air as her. The city's evening hum wrapped around them. You stayed for my speech, he said, his tone soft, searching. She gave a faint smile. I didn't stay for you, Sean. I stayed for the message. His lips curved into a sad smile. Still sharp, he murmured. Still right. There was a pause. Then he said, I've thought about you more times than I can count. About what I did. About what I destroyed. Naomi crossed her arms, not in anger, but composure. Regret is easy when time has softened the consequences. He nodded slowly. True, but I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know you were right about everything. Her eyes softened, not out of affection, but empathy. I don't need to be right, Sean. I just needed peace. And I found it. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I never did. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them felt like closure itself. Something pure, unforced, final. The streetlights flickered on, casting faint gold on their faces. Then Naomi said, You once told me love was a distraction. You used me to climb. And now look where you are, successful, yet still searching. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was reflective, almost sorrowful. That's the price of using what was meant to be felt. Sean looked down, hands trembling slightly. I deserve that. He lifted his gaze again. You look happy, Naomi. Truly. She smiled faintly. Happiness isn't loud, Sean. It's quiet. It's peace after chaos. There was nothing left to say. The story that had once burned between them now lay cold, ashes scattered by time. Sean wanted to say more, to explain, to apologize, but he could see it in her eyes. She didn't need anything from him anymore. She had outgrown the version of herself that once waited for his validation. He took a step back. Goodbye, Naomi. She nodded gently. Goodbye, Sean. He turned and walked away into the night, his figure fading beneath the streetlights, swallowed by the moving crowd. Naomi stood for a while, watching, not with longing, not with hate, but with something like gratitude. He had once been her greatest pain, but now he was simply a story she had lived through. She exhaled deeply, the kind of breath that feels like release, and whispered to herself, "I used you, I will never marry you, and that will always be enough." Then she turned, entered her car, and drove away into the calm of her own life. The past had come calling, but she had answered, and this time, she hung up for good. Months passed after that night, and Naomi hardly thought about it again. Not because she had forgotten, but because the memory no longer asked for attention. Her life had slipped back into rhythm. Early mornings, soft music while she brewed coffee, the quiet hum of her apartment as sunlight crept across the walls. The river painting she'd finished years ago hung near the window now. Each time the light touched it, she felt a strange calm, like the universe was reminding her that movement, not stillness, was what healed her. Every so often, she still received emails from conference organizers who mentioned Sean's talks. They said he'd become a respected voice in business ethics. She would nod when she read them, proud in a detached way, as if hearing that an old classmate had finally grown up. She never replied, never reached out. Closure, she had learned, didn't need correspondence. Sean, somewhere miles away, lived quietly. He ran workshops for startups and taught at a small university. His students liked him because he was real. He spoke about failure the way some people speak about faith, with honesty, with a tremor of reverence. Once, a reporter asked if he'd ever loved anyone deeply. He smiled faintly and said, "Yes." And I learned that love is not proof of goodness. Sometimes it only proves you're capable of destruction. The quote made its way online, stripped of context, shared as inspiration. But only he knew whose face it carried. One evening, he found a letter in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a simple note in familiar handwriting. "We were both young in the wrong ways. I wish you peace. N." He sat for a long time, holding that paper as though it were light itself. Then he folded it neatly, placed it inside his journal, and wrote beneath it, "Some people forgive you quietly, so they can keep living loudly." After that day, he stopped visiting the river. He didn't need to. Forgiveness, even if distant, had reached him. Naomi, on the other hand, began writing a book, not about heartbreak, but about rebuilding. She called it The Art of Letting Go While Holding On. It was a reflection on ambition, integrity, and love's quieter lessons. The final chapter read, "Sometimes survival is the only love story that matters." When the book was published, it touched thousands who didn't even know her name, only her words. They quoted her online, under photos of sunsets and breakups, not realizing those words had been born from the ashes of a man who once said he could never marry her. The world kept turning. Seasons changed. One winter morning, Naomi stood by her window again, watching snow drift lazily down the street. Her phone buzzed, a message from Susan, a photo of her kids making a snowman. Naomi smiled, sent back a heart emoji, then whispered to herself, "Life always finds a way to be beautiful again." She believed it now, fully. And somewhere across the same city, Sean watched that same snowfall from a cafe window, coffee cooling beside him. He closed his eyes, not to dream of her, but to remember what she had taught him without meaning to, that love misused still leaves something worth learning. He raised his cup slightly, as though in a silent toast, to lessons, to endings, to the kind of love that doesn't return but still redeems you in its absence. No music played. No one noticed. Just two people in different corners of the same world, finally at peace. The story that began with manipulation and ambition ended not with forgiveness spoken aloud, but with understanding quietly lived. Naomi closed her journal that night and whispered, "It's over." And it truly was. Because the final act of love is not holding on. It's letting go without hate.